TV original program.
Jeff Koons is certainly one of the best-known artists working in America today.
He is this quintessential American character and one of the most fascinating people of the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
Jeff Koons is a salesman, and he's selling you Jeff Koons.
Is it art? Of course it's art.
It's timeless.
When something is good, everyone knows it.
My name's Jeff Koons. I'm an artist, fine arts artist.
Jeff Koons isn't universally admired.
You know, when I first saw his work, I was a student, and I think I saw a picture of the Equilibrium series, and I was very intrigued by it, and I went to New York City to see the work a couple of times, and there was just something about Jeff's first works. They had a Duchampian quality, that sense of the ready-made, that was the immediate reference, except there was something almost surrealist about them.
I went to a gallery in the late 80s and saw a show called Banality, and it was a pretty shocking and disturbing show. When you walked in, there were these large sculptures of, say, Michael Jackson with his chimpanzee Bubbles sitting on his lap, and there was also one of a woman, and she was holding a big Pink Panther stuffed animal. And yet the odd thing about these is that they were made out of ceramic and painted porcelain. They were these beautifully finished things as if they were out of the Palace of Versailles or something.
In the mid-'80s, I was working with the theme of guilt and shame, and trying to use different examples or metaphors of guilt and shame, because the dialogue was really about people embracing their own cultural history, self-acceptance.
The thing that struck you looking at that is that Koons caused a time warp in there where you realized that all societies, no matter how sophisticated, have this fascination with glitz and kitsch and celebrity, and he really nailed that in this show.
The notion of kitsch has been prominent in distinguishing bad work from good work. Many art critics think that kitsch deals with work that is in consciously bad taste, like little figurines, toys. And what Jeff Koons does is play with that notion of bad taste and actually interrogate the viewer. Is this really bad? If it's bad, why are you smiling? If it's bad, why are you attracted to this work? And I think so much of his work is engaging on a superficial level, but fundamentally poses questions to the viewer of which the viewer may not even be aware.
Someone can be suspicious about why they like something, or they can be suspicious about why they find something beautiful. They begin to question their own instincts and see if they're correct in the way that they're thinking or feeling. But beauty never lies, and those kinds of powerful, strong materials never lie.
If people look at my imagery and they get a sense of kind of consumerism or mass culture, it's that I'm working with images that are very familiar to us, and because it's about acceptance, and it's that, you know, these things are fine, they're wonderful, and it's accepting of them.
The notion of kitsch changes all the time. It changes through centuries, it changes through year. Like fashion, it changes year to year, what's kitsch and what's not kitsch. So I think it's true that he relies on everyday images, but again, we find that a lot of what's kitsch, a Mickey Mouse or a Hulk, become lasting icons. And I think that he's really interested in that notion of what looks kitsch at one moment becomes iconic at a next.
Some people just react very strongly against that kitsch, against stuff that you see on a shelf in a suburban house, a Hummel figurine or something like that, and they just cannot imagine that being art. And I think it's the twist that he makes on it that makes it really interesting and radiates out certain ideas.
Jeff Koons' art is actually, it is a reflection of a certain Americana. He takes the ordinary and he doesn't make representations out of it. He just gives us what we as a culture are. And what he gives you is Americana as elitism. In that, he's accomplished a pretty amazing feat.
So it borrows from something else? Well, almost everything borrows from something else. There's a divine interconnectedness to all things, truly.
Part of what Jeff tries to do is surprise us. That's certainly an element of that. The giant egg, the giant balloon dog, the bunny at first. There's a strong tradition of that if you think about the surrealist artists, that the element of surprising juxtapositions or things that are slightly discordant attract our attention.
I've never really desired to make something pop, just popular. But I have had a desire to make things that people enjoy, because that's what I'm looking for in life. I want to come across things that I enjoy, that in some way enhance, you know, what it feels like to be alive, what it means to be alive.
I think it's important to see that Jeff's work doesn't provide just one reading. Partly what he's doing is creating objects that are complex enough to be read many ways by us and then many ways by others in the future. If you look at the lifeboats in the Aqualung series, that's a very powerful series of work. You have these objects cast in heavy bronze that are life-saving devices. So you can read that many ways. It's an open situation. Are the two forces of the life-saving meaning of these objects or life-saving function counteracted by their heavy weight? The boat doesn't float? Or is it actually a making bronze, making monumental?
Actually, what I see is great consistency in his work over the last 20 years. Certain themes predominate, but I think the most interesting theme or interest that we see from the beginning of his career to the end is the idea of breath and breathing. And whether it's in the aqualungs that he did in bronze, or the vacuum cleaners that he did, to the train suspended on the crane that's going to breathe, come to life.
This is a project that I've designed that probably be built for LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. It's called Train. This will run 3 times a day. It's 161 feet tall. This is a 70-foot steam engine.
The primacy of human breath is something I can see consistently throughout his work.
First and foremost, you make the work for yourself, but at the same time, you are interested in sharing that sensation, and the people that enjoy your work basically are in tune to this type of intensity. So it's something that you share in common. I was always an artist since the time I was a child. I would, after school, always be taking art lessons, and my sister Karen's 3 years older. And so because she was older, it was like she could do everything better. And all of a sudden this thing, art, came along where I could draw something, and my parents would say, you know, Jeff, that's great. And I felt that somehow I was at least equal, or, you know, possibly better, that I could finally compete with my sister. So art gave me a sense of self, and it's really fulfilled that from that moment.
His dad, I guess, owned a furniture store, and Jeff told me a story about his dad every week rearranging the furniture in the window. So there you have objects of a very regular domestic environment, continually rearranged. Well, what's the criteria for rearranging them? To think about other ways of seeing them.
He was very much influenced by artists like Ed Paschke or Jim Nutt, kind of cult figure in the Chicago art scene.
I remember seeing Jim Nutt's show, and then seeing Ed Paschke's work, and Carl Worsom, and Westerman, all the Chicago images.
And his relationship with Chicago is a very strong relationship. He studied there.
I went to school in Chicago. You know, I feel like I really learned a lot about art. I learned how surrealism, really at the beginning of the 20th century, was a base about self-acceptance and about how, as a community, we had to learn how to accept ourselves. And if you follow art history from that, you can see that work continues to look externally then.
What is amazing about Jeff, it looks like very much consumer-based, pop-based work, you know, related to the surface of society. But in fact, you know, he has an amazing link with art history.
If you look at pop art, you look at the imagist work, there's this continual transcendence, looking outside the self, looking for an objective.
You know, he had a very interesting career. He was a banker for a while. He was at the admissions desk at the Museum of Modern Art. He befriended Andy Warhol.
Sometimes people make a connection of my work to Warhol's, but I feel very connected, you know, to so many artists. I mean, I feel connected Roy Lichtenstein and, you know, Dali and Duchamp, and, you know, the list goes on and on.
What is amazing, and he's talking about Courbet, he's talking about Rubens, it talks like they are colleagues.
I started to become more interested in subjective art and art that was about personal iconography.
Jeff's inspiration comes from a mixture of everyday objects and a fantasy about those objects and their potential.
Over the last 20 years, he's had a very consistent body of work which treats certain themes: life, death, sex, passion, consumerism, modern society, and its obsessions.
Art that lasts tends to hook into big themes about humanity, about culture, and also tends to be art that both reflects its time, it has images of its own time, so it's not, it fixes itself as from a time and place, and also has lasting potential, multiple readings, that it can be read differently by other cultures and other times. That gives it life.
He's already solidly written into art history. I mean, if the world ends tomorrow, Jeff still already has his place in the great pantheon of art history. I mean, he's covered.
The work of Jeff Koons always touch a different period in time, and the reference, you know, they're hidden in the work. His references are there not as gratuitous quotation to be high art, to show that he knows art, but because he sees in the present, as in the past, a very strong link.
Wanting to connect to archetype, to connect to art history in a sense that it's about we feel the same as our ancestors did in the history of mankind.
I think artists like Jeff are always grasping for ways to make things look very much of the present and also have them connect to sort of timeless themes, timeless ideas, so that they'll persist into the future.
If I think about 15 years ago and today, the work developed, changed, matured, went in different direction, but his way to approach the work has been always basically the same.
I think that my work has gone through stages where it's been more involved with a linguistic narrative, and then it's gone into more physical narrative, and I think that I'm involved in more of a physical narrative now.
His work has evolved from its beginnings, where I think Jeff relied more on appropriation, on taking objects that existed in the world, even if they were modified or reframed. More recently, he's taking much more responsibility for creating those images from scratch.
Great art overcome a certain level of great ignorance. You know, people recognize images without knowing where they come from. And I think most of Jeff's works are at this level.
You know, the balloon dog is another image that's had a very powerful presence, and I think part of its power is not just that it's of the present, but that it also has this archaic pose. You can look at it from one perspective and it looks like an Egyptian sphinx. And I don't think that's a wrong way to look at it.
At one point you will see the balloon puppy or rabbit again, and you will appreciate it as icons and not works of an artist.
The bunny, for example, it is probably one of the most important icons we have of our present day. Now, who knows if it will last centuries into the future, but that's probably going to be an icon that lasts. It has so much about our present-day culture, maybe you could say kitsch, but it has so much that's iconic. Its frontal pose is very archaic, and yet the fact that it's made out of polished stainless steel and reflects its environment is a very modern way of looking at an icon, that it takes in our reflection as part of its iconic status rather than being something separate like the Mona Lisa smile that smiles at us itself. It's like the Mona Lisa under glass, if you will, where you can see your own reflection in it.